Hello, and welcome back to the PetroNerds Podcast. This is episode 17. Today is Friday, May 21st, 2021. It is the day after Ethan Bellamy's birthday. Happy birthday, Ethan.
Thank you very much, Trisha. You know, it's funny. You're the only woman who texts me at 1:30 in the morning about the IEA. Usually it's about something else. So thank you very much for making me laugh last night.
I also texted him happy birthday at like 12:15 on his birthday to make sure he knew.
Anyway, thank you. So it has been an action-packed week.
It has. There's a lot to talk about.
I'm excited to talk about all the stuff that's going on around the world and here at home. We are coming to you live or recorded from Axel's den here in Denver, Colorado. We'll hope he doesn't bark at the landscapers next door.
Yes.
But you make do with what you have. So right now, this is our podcast studio. So today we're going to cover, at least at a minimum, oil prices, Iran, the IEA hilarious report that came out. And we can walk around the world. It's hurricane season already. Gas is at $3 because of some, outlook from NOAA on cool weather.
Oil prices last night, though. I mean, so today we're at 63 WTI. Last night I saw 61 and change, and that was around 1 a.m, but 61 and change. So, I mean, this oil price market piece, I think I'd love to kind of dive into in this thing with Iran, because I do think Iran is weighing on the market. We do have a ceasefire that does seem to be holding in with Israeli and Palestinians in Gaza, although I heard that there's some police issues going on within Jerusalem, so it doesn't look good. That hasn't really weighed. That really hasn't weighed on the oil market too much. So we're hearing positive stuff out of from Rouhani, from the Iranian leadership, saying, hey, things are looking really good. And we heard this a few weeks ago as well. And I think it was Blinken had to get on TV and basically say, no, we're not doing, we haven't agreed to anything yet. So he's sort of pushing this. And
wait, who is that?
This is Blinken, Secretary of State.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Just want to make sure.
Secretary Blinken. Secretary of State.
I know there are a lot of Republicans who listen to this podcast who have intentionally not made themselves familiar with every Biden administration
so Blinken
official.
is our Secretary of State.
Right.
So he got on TV. This was a few weeks ago and said, hey, we haven't agreed to anything. Well, and he's been saying that in stuff. So Iran, though, the leadership. So last night, you're seeing oil prices slide this past week, and you're seeing, and it does seem to be Iran seems to be one demand outlooks are a little bit concerned given everything happening in India still with COVID, but I think it has more to do with Iran.
Huge acceleration in something like 250,000 per day new cases in India.
Yes, and honestly, India seems to be that. I think the concerns around COVID are still relatively muted because the effectiveness of the vaccine in the U.S. has been so good. So it's kind of the thought. I think the market in general has looked at everything and said essentially Pfizer and Moderna have proven effective in spreading. So basically they can stop spreading. So if these countries get it, I think the thought is that it will stop. And India has sort of refused to do lockdowns like they did before because they don't have the same type of country as we do. And their people live very, very tightly together. And they had people that couldn't get home and couldn't get from region to region. And it was major, major dislocations and problems. And so they've sort of refused to do the same lockdown they had. So they're kind of living with the situation. And I think it was 350,000 cases so the cases per day, I believe, are coming down to a degree. And there's pockets. It's very messy. It's really bad. And they did just say, India just said they're refusing LNG shipments. So they're trying to rework LNG cargoes that they.
So clearly there's some impact on energy demand.
100%. So LNG oil is going to be impacted in the short term, but it's a short term thing.
So that's our first digression on oil. But second one is that China appears to be stepping up its crude imports now and is undergoing a full recovery, which is more the demand indicator that people are looking at.
Yes, and they're over 11 million barrels. They're 11 million barrels a day and change. It's always between 11 and 12 of crude oil of crude oil imports. The tricky thing there is that they're also exporting. I saw that their exports for product were up, so which is good in that you see that the market's healthy, so it means that other countries are demanding it. So I think in 2015, 2016, one of the things that happened was we were able to sort of support, or at least China was able to sort of kind of support the market. We didn't have the massive crash because they were exporting to Pakistan and stuff for product. they weren't obviously able to do that during COVID. And now we're seeing about 1.7 million barrels a day product exports, which means the export market's healthy, but it also means they're exporting it. So the refineries are running well, which is great for refinery profitability in China, but it also means that they're not consuming it. So you just have to keep that in context. And that happens, if you historically look at most countries, if you have a lopside, if they're demanding more gasoline than diesel, et cetera, then they're going to be exporting. So that makes sense. But it's important to know if you're exporting a decent amount, you're not consuming it. And that's just something to flag. Okay,
so back from China on the demand side to Iran on the supply side, they have a bilateral agreement. The Iranians will export to China. And the context around why the JCPOA and the Iran deal matters is that right now Iran's at about 2.4 million barrels per day.
Yep.
And pre-sanction, they were at about 3.9 million barrels per day. So the market is basically digesting another 1.5 million barrels a day plus of potential supply coming onto the market. The Russian oil minister said the market can easily digest that. But clearly there's sort of this herky-jerky restart demand growth and, new supply growth coming online, potentially from OPEC cheating and or increased quotas. And therefore, that's why we're probably getting this oil volatility in the 60 to 70 barrel range.
Absolutely. And I think so you summarized that well. I think there's a couple things with Iran, and they're really getting, and I want to loop back, make sure we loop back and hit this inflation piece, because I do think it's important, because I think it's actually positive and bullish for oil investment and sentiment. So Iran, if you look at the OPEC figures from the OPEC report that came out in last week, those show that Iran's been north of 2 million barrels a day, and they basically, everybody said they inched their way up. We've talked about it in previous podcasts that China's taking those barrels, they sort of send them to a different country, they label them as something else, and so we know China's getting between 500,000 to 1 million barrels a day from Iran. Now that's a decent amount, and so it's increased. So we see Middle East Economic Survey (MEES) puts up their numbers at just like almost 700,000 barrels per day for Iranian exports, crude and condensate, basically from that's hopeful of returning. So they have 2.5 million barrels a day that they were exporting. That obviously came down considerably, and now they're pushing north of 1 million barrels a day. But actual production, we're showing from OPEC, is north of 2 million barrels per day. And the thought is that they will go back to, they can easily add 1 million to 2 million barrels a day of production relatively quickly. And I think what's interesting to that is that there was an article from, and it's probably, I'm sure there was everywhere, but Iran, it's a Bloomberg article that said Iran to start oil exports port skirting troubled strait. So Iran has a pipeline ready to go. So the timing on all this is interesting. The fact that Iran's leadership is pushing, the go ahead in these sanctions, it's hard because, they've definitely played their cards well. They basically said, hey, we're going to increase our uranium enrichment, and we're going to get really close to having a nuclear weapon, and therefore then we will bring everyone in to lift sanctions. At the same time, we're going to export all this crude to China. So to me, they're definitely playing everyone that they can. And it does seem that from what we've heard out of Blinken in the White House, it does, and from the market and the reviews, is that it does seem like we're probably going to agree to have an agreement in place because we want to try to control the situation in the near term. The problem is we're probably not going to have whole lot of control. So it'll help things in the near term to decrease their uranium enrichment, but it's not necessarily going to give us a lot of control. So it means that we are going to be, adding barrels back to the market, and that is going to create some problems within Saudi Arabia. And there is, and within OPEC, and there is a general link with the Israeli issue, because now that we do have the Abraham Accords, which is, agreements between even, pacts or whatever agreements or peace agreements with Israel and all these Arab countries, I believe Hamas was firing, Hamas and Iran are linked. And there are some concerns between the Arabs or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and Iran's role in it as well. So this is all interwoven, and I don't think goes away anytime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's interesting is that almost all the global strife now involves energy. You've got Hamas and the IDF. And remember, Israel is now an energy producer with Tamar, and that relates to Chevron. They're basically back in action now, but Israel is now a gas producer, which is interesting. You got strife in Colombia, where that has actually curtailed some production. There were a couple companies. Let me see.
Israel's a large gas producer now with Leviathan and formerly Noble, now Chevron.
Yeah. So Gulf Terra, GTE and GPRK both had production curtailed in Colombia. And then we had a Houthi drone that was shot down by the Saudis. So and by the way, my friend, thank you to the United States Navy, interdicted a big shipment of guns supplied most likely by the Iranians to the Houthis. So you may have seen some photos about that. So thanks, United States Navy. It's pretty interesting that all this strife is tied in directly to key energy markets. Yeah,
and I think that tells you, one, so traders could just not be honing in on it, but it does tell you the state of the market. And I think that a couple things, that there's these concerns about inflation. There's obviously the concerns about ESG, the grain movement, anti-oil, everything. So that weighs down on oil. But you would think 5-10 years ago, we would have had a risk premium. You couldn't have had, even if, you have the Arab, Palestinian conflict, even if that doesn't directly impact energy, it's in the Middle East. People are concerned to spill over. Like we said, there is a linkage with Iran. That means there's a linkage with Saudi Arabia. That means there's a linkage with OPEC. It's the Middle East. So it's a very,
Not to mention that as of, I think the last stat I saw was there were still 8,000 southeastern U.S. gasoline stations without fuel because of the attack on Colonial Pipeline by most likely Russian hackers.
Yeah, so should we back up and say that I wouldn't say we were wrong in the last podcast, but that it has had a slightly more long-term effect. One, because people did exacerbate it by hoarding and getting grocery sacks and
prisoner's dilemma. Yes.
So there's some hoarding, I still think, but it is up and they're delivering supplies. They're delivering gasoline supplies.
They had some network outages this week, but they are up and running, delivered supplies after they paid a ransom.
Yeah, after they paid their ransom. And, the images of people using laundry baskets with holes in them and grocery sacks to get gasoline.
Reminds me of the Dapple protesters who were out of gas on the highway with a sign up that said looking for gas. There's certain ironies here.
If it's got holes in it, it's not going to be able to hold the gasoline, folks. But that's maybe for another time of educating. So this Iranian thing too also is they have a pipeline that they've been working on. So when squaring the circle of going back to this Iran thing and the timing of how they're talking about this with leadership and everything is that and increasing these exports to China. So they basically have a pipeline that's going to come online, and it basically goes around the Strait of Hormuz and basically perfect to the Gulf of Oman. And it's the JASC, I believe it's called I'm pronouncing this wrong, pipeline. So they'll be able to basically, this pipeline's going to be able to deliver crude around the Strait of Hormuz, and then you can pick it up. So you don't have to go through that strait. That's pretty big. It doesn't even matter. This could be 100,000 barrels a day. They start with, it can be 1 million barrels a day. Doesn't matter. Every bit of crude that goes through that they can deliver that can go through the pipeline, they can deliver to that facility. That means that crude does not have to go to the Strait of Hormuz, which if you look up oil choke points, that is a major choke point. It's a tiny little strait. So it helps them alleviate a major choke point in their exports. It also means that Iran has been thinking about this for a long time. So we've had sanctions. The U.S. has had sanctions on Iran for quite a while. Obviously during the Trump administration and in the Obama administration, and then we did the JCPOA, and we were in all these agreements and lifted these sanctions and allowed them to do stuff. But Iran's been under sanctions for a long time. The fact that they've done this and they're gearing up for this, they definitely saw Biden as a signal of a much more dovish, less hawkish leadership that was going to sort of allow them to do stuff. And they've been doing it. India has also said that they're happy to purchase stuff from Iran. That is really to piss off the Saudis more than anything, I think, as opposed to real diversification. But I think India and China China's already buying it, but they're ready and waiting to buy crude from Iran.
Yes, and it's interesting that the Biden administration has a fairly dovish foreign policy. So you've got the JCPOA coming back, not a ton of options because of the bilateral agreement from Iran and China, but also not enforcing the sanctions on the contractors for Nord Stream 2, which is the gas pipe that is increasing supply from Russia to Germany. So
basically, they gave the go. They essentially didn't give the green light, but they basically didn't continue pressure. So essentially, we do have an administration that's okay with Nord Stream 2. And to be honest, Nord Stream 2 was basically already built. You do have very close, this is the major natural gas source for Germany and other parts of Europe and goes through Ukraine. But this is problematic because you have a leadership that's I think Biden's going to get criticism, not just from conservatives and the Republican Party on Iran, but I think if he ends up being a little bit softer on China than people expect, and he's soft on Iran, it's foreign policy. You can't be seen as too soft in foreign policy. And I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat. It just doesn't look good and it doesn't play right, especially when there's ramifications for it, especially if oil prices slide, which they probably will if you had 2 million barrels a day. So I think he's playing an interesting game of being, Obama was very apologetic when he came into office. And I don't think Biden's being completely apologetic, but it's on energy, he's being extremely hypocritical. So he's basically put a leasing ban on current federal lands for leasing. Vicky Holub in the Q1 earnings call,
the CEO of
Occidental, Q1 earnings call, Occidental Petroleum, Vicky Holub makes a very clear statement about, she basically says we have permits on existing, basically she believes that we're going to continue to get permits on existing federal leases. And she calls out the administration though, and really calls out how bad it would be for the US if we had a federal leasing, if we continued the moratorium on federal leases, which basically, I guess people are now saying August that this is going to go through. I think that this is, she kind of alludes to the fact that she thinks it could be real, that they could continue this. So the fact that even if they lifted it, right now you have a leasing ban on federal leases in the US, but so the president has done that with the executive order on climate change, but is okay basically the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and canceled Keystone XL and is going to lift sanctions on Iran, which is an immediate impact to increase oil production. So that's hypocrisy for global oil and gas production and climate change. That if you and we 100% can do it cleaner here than they can do it in Iran.
No question about that. I misspoke earlier and said Gulf Terra. I meant to say Grand Tierra GTE. That is a good point, which is no pipelines here, no development here, but allow Iran to go forward. And it seems like a challenging and very inconsistent policy to justify, and certainly leaves the administration open for significant criticism.
Absolutely. And all you have to do is see you guys can pull up the actual OPEC numbers and see where in OPEC's monthly report and see where Saudi Arabia is at. They were just their production's still down. So they did add a little bit back in April, but it's a smidgen. And we saw, Iran, I said, is at over 2 million barrels per day. Every country seemed to add a little bit. I think their net number overall was an additional 75,000 barrels a day. Actually, Venezuela was down. I think that helped them a little bit. So we haven't seen, Iran's important in this in terms of the oil market and oil prices, because we haven't actually seen what the barrels that are being brought back. So we need to see how much was actually brought back in May. And I doubt it was a ton because I'm sure they've brought back a little bit more. And I'm sure, Russia's at 10.76 million barrels per day. So they're edging up to 11 million barrels per day. So the market has absorbed that decently. But I think, at least from those April numbers, Saudi Arabia is holding back pretty well in terms of production. So they're not unleashing it. And that means that they said that they would add, they said between April and July we were going to add 2 million barrels per day back to the market. So if we also, the reason why you're seeing some trepidation in prices is because if these sanctions on Iran are lifted, and Iran will try to increase production as quickly as possible to capture this upside in oil prices, it's going to pressure it. So likely, I think, and it was Lombard Odier. I think that they were on Bloomberg. I'm not super familiar with them, but they're a group. They're one of their guys was on Bloomberg, and he was calling for $60 oil, basically for the same reasons that we've been saying the whole time, is that OPEC has all these barrels. They're going to have to bring them back to the market steadily. And then this whole Iran thing. So this whole $60 oil is getting a little bit more traction, the likelihood of these Iran sanctions being lifted. And then last piece on inflation.
Oh, that was actually a real pause where I could have jumped in, and I didn't even jump on it. I know,
you should have. I want your thoughts on this, and I want to tease this out a little bit, because we talked about, obviously the concerns about inflation are huge, and the Fed's minutes came out. And you probably saw this, that they sort of alluded to the fact that they would be open to maybe talking about in the future, at a future meeting, they would maybe theoretically talk about tapering, so that's a good thing, right? They're thinking about tapering. And so that moved the market. The market came down a little bit. But how this relates back to oil, I think it is important because I was listening to the China Geopolitics podcast. Another shout out. That is a really good podcast.
Who does it?
It's the South China Post. They're based in Hong Kong, and they do a really, really good podcast on everything China. But they have this great economist, and he always gets back into this inflation stuff. So the inflation read in the U.S., which we talked about in a couple weeks ago in the podcast, was we had this massive 4.2%. The interesting piece about that is it wasn't so much, we had a 4.2% year-over-year inflation read, and that, was strong. But the trickiness with the Fed is that it was a 0.8% higher month over month. So basically, the Fed is saying it's transitory, it's short term, but we had a monthly increase of nearly 1%. And if you go to the grocery store and you see how damn small those cereal boxes are, I have honestly not been grocery shopping in forever. So I went to the store with my mom to help him grocery shop. The sizes of everything have gotten smaller.
Is that because you don't eat?
Shut up. No, it's because
you are wearing a dress that you bought in college.
This is true. This is true. That's a good thing, never have to. I buy new clothes, but then I just end up with too many of them. So I think this inflation piece is interesting because Dan Pickering mentioned and so this guy, Lombard Odier from Lombard Odier and a couple others, and actually JP Morgan asset manager was on Bloomberg last night, and he was saying, hey, we are advising clients, who weren't necessarily comfortable getting back into energy to get back into energy and industrials to sort of pivot a little bit as to diversify with inflation. And, Dan Pickering had actually mentioned in Clubhouse with Chuck Yates on Wednesday night that he, Chuck was kind of painting a doomsday scenario for oil and gas and everything and how young people don't like it. And Dan was saying, we are seeing actually just very recently kind of a move back into it. And I think it's real in that, oil prices are north of 60. It's relatively steady. And obviously, ARK Investments, we've done, what's her name? Why am I blanking on? Kathy Wood, and loves that tech. Her portfolio has been decimated because it has no diversification. And I think people are really realizing that you just can't be in one basket. And so oil and the fact that, we're seeing a demand recovery in just the overall economic growth. But that inflation rate is really important on that because it means that when we had that big of an inflation jump, it means that everyone has to revise their forecast. So not just in the US, but globally, everyone's revising their forecast for growth. But eventually, when you have that high of inflation, it impacts economic growth. And that's what impacts oil. That will ultimately impact oil demand and oil prices. So inflation is not like a little bit is a good thing. Too much of it is a bad thing, and too much of it too fast. And we have this very pandemic-induced inflation where, corporations are actually hoarding stuff. So this is like a bit like toilet paper, but, we still have the chip shortage, which most of these semiconductor chips are made in Taiwan, which is a whole nother hot button issue. But that we have this chip shortage that Ford said they're going to be down at least through the second half. So they reduced the output again for the second half, and they won't be back up to normal till toward the end of the year and next year. So, all these things are sort of exacerbating this, and then it's messy. And my concern and warning to people is that it could impact, too much of it. And then the Fed having to, if the Fed tapers like this fall, or this winter or something, that would start easing. But if they increase interest rates or they have to tap on the brakes too hard with interest rates, that cools off the economy. And then not necessarily you have a recession, but it cools things off, and that impacts demand.
Yeah. So a couple things on inflation. Firstly, we've had this incredible combination of both fiscal and monetary stimulus. And the only thing there's a couple things that worry me. The first is that the fiscal stimulus will be ending because the COVID related payouts are going to be over. So that is pressure on I'd say the bottom economic tier in the US and other places where you've seen that sort of protection. So that's a problem. At the same time that the inflation in consumer prices is likely to drive up the cost of goods and services. So that pinch really worries me for people at the bottom of the socioeconomic platform, which we don't need any more pressure because the class warfare that we've seen in the, it's just a layup for, more Antifa type street protests and whatever. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we don't really know whether it's, there's a case to be made that it's transitory. There's a case to be made that it's structural. Regardless, if you look at the great financial crisis, if you look at the history of the Fed funds rate with respect to the cycles in the market and the economic cycles, let's just start at Greenspan. The Fed, in my view, is a pro-cyclical crash generator. So they are absurdly good at giving the market too much stimulus for too long and creating and sowing the seeds of the next catastrophe. So they apparently have learned nothing. And if they don't create some ammo, because the Fed funds rate has been just declining, they don't have any ammo in there, and they don't have any arrows in their quiver left.
They say though, and they say they have arrows in their quiver. So I will ask you. So there's a couple caveats. So those are really, really good points, and I'm glad.
Let me finish though.
Okay.
They didn't fit, and they're monetizing an enormous deficit. Mm-hmm. So the amount of fiscal irresponsibility from all parties, Congress, the White House, which wants to spend another $4 trillion or some other number on infrastructure, and the Fed is ridiculous. So that ends very badly. And, we've also got, I think you mentioned Stanley Druckenmiller on our last podcast, that there's a real chance that in 10 to 15 years, the U.S. loses its reserve currency status, which is very bad and kind of like end of empire British pound type stuff. So I know that's not going to help people make money or invest money in this next quarter, but the world that I want my kids and their prospective children to live in does not include the U.S. losing its reserve currency status.
So I don't disagree with. I agree with that.
Boy.
We're not going to. We are not going to lose the world's reserve currency status, because even in the financial crisis,
we'll revisit this on PetroNerds Podcast episode number 350.
We
about 10 years.
We were the cleanest, dirtiest shirt in the closet. We caused the Great Recession. We caused the financial crisis, and yet, people thought we would tank. And I was at the London School of Economics at this time with people, poo-pooing the U.S. and saying the rise of China, the fall of the U.S. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because we have the U.S. Treasury market is one of the most it's the most liquid and transparent markets in the world.
But the only people buying treasuries are the Fed.
Well, yes. So hold on here.
The foreigners have stopped buying it.
The trickiness, and I think the Fed is playing this wrong, right? So I think they want to, they've gotten partly into this class 4-4 piece because they're trying to get full maximum employment, full unemployment. They're letting the economy run out. So we are 4.2%. Right. The Fed has said they want to go. They were okay running hot north of 2% for a while. We're at 4.2%, folks. How long are you going to let it run that hot? They explain that it's transitory. And they sort of, when you get into the nuances of the pandemic and what COVID did and how it's COVID and it's the fiscal response and it's the checks and the stimulus and the fact that we have 8.1 million jobs open and over 9 million people unemployed. And I've taken pictures. I'm going to tweet them. So I stop in at the Come and Go. They're offering it's $15.50 an hour. I stopped to Come and Go in Silverthorne to go to the bathroom. I went to the Starbucks yesterday, and they are offering. They have job openings there. Everywhere you go that's a service oriented has jobs. $15 an hour. Lots of people don't want those jobs. Partly for good reason, because some of them are still, they still have kids at home from school, and all the schools haven't reopened. That's probably going to change in the fall. But it's also because you have $22 an hour unemployment benefits. And so that's creating, this gap in the workers. And that gap shortage is creating inflationary pressures because people don't have the goods that they need. They don't have the services they need. Corporations are hoarding. And so it's a very, very unique type of inflation that's been induced by the coronavirus pandemic and the forced economic shutdown and the fiscal response, which is too much. You got to get rid of those things. They have to, at the very least, be gone by September because we're going to have massive issues with that. And then we actually have the stimulus checks that have created inflation. I mean, people, have gone out and bought lots of things with these checks. We now have, instead of the child tax credit, and you have children, so you'll probably be getting these checks in July.
Zero.
People will be getting $300 a month per kid. Or roughly, it's $250 to $300 a month per kid every month through December. I am all for helping people out with their children. My sister's one of those. She has 2 kids and she's a single mom, and that's great. But I guarantee you an extra $300 a month in people's pockets per kid it's not going to, it's certainly not going to depress the inflationary pressure environment, So that's a real issue. And then it's just all these things together, I think are messy. Your comment about though, the asset bubbles, that's the real one that I think Kaplan and folks within the Fed, and I'm going to go through those Fed minutes as well to make sure we see that. But that's what I think people are getting concerned about and why they're saying that they're hinting about the, potentially thinking about tapering. They need to start tapering immediately, and they need to have a slow interest rate rise in January. That means some of us who have any kind of cash savings can start putting those in CDs and they're stable, and then we don't create these asset bubbles. Right now, everyone is freaking out about inflation and they're searching for yield. And so guess what? People are actually entertaining getting back into shale, getting back into oil, getting back into all these things that they didn't think they would get back into because they want to hedge against inflation. And the market has to eventually balance out. And so it's going to create unique circumstances, which we're already seeing. And there will be repercussions for it, 100%. But the Fed and the fiscal side have got to get aligned. And I don't think, it doesn't seem as rosy in DC. I'm going to DC next week, so hopefully I'll get some insight on this. It doesn't quite seem as rosy on the Hill in DC. Biden's these big infrastructure plans with these big tax bills don't seem like they're going down quite well. We haven't seen a whole lot of yes, this is going through tomorrow.
Well, it doesn't make a ton of sense to spend a bunch of money on fiscal stimulus when you've got inflation. And, it's
everything. One, you're going to create more inflation, and two, everything's really expensive. So I think it was in this China Geopolitics podcast, they're talking about steel in China. Well, some companies, so they get the iron ore from Australia, which is another complication because they are on the outs. China and Australia are on the outs. They're not purchasing any wine from Australia. They have they've put bans on imports of lots of Australian goods. They're thinking about doing iron ore, and iron ore, they get 60% of it from Australia. That's how they make their steel. Some companies in China are literally saying we're not going to make the steel because we can't afford to make it. So steel prices are going up. And China is now warning about signs of inflation. So they're trying to work on this as well. It's a problem when the US and China, the two biggest economies in the world, are experiencing inflation, and that, the UK is opening up and Europe is opening up and people are going to Portugal for everything. We're all going to experience it. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The fact that China sort of, and I wouldn't say they're tapering or anything, but they're warning about it. Yes, it now creates problems for Biden. And when he says that, I have to say this because it drives me a little crazy, but when he gets up and he says, well, I've added more jobs than any U.S. president. Yes, you started at a very, very low base, and it doesn't mean that you didn't do a good job of getting those jobs back online, but any president was probably going to add some of those jobs back because we were such a low base. And, every Bush helped Obama get the TARP package in. So it helped teed everything up for Obama for the recovery. Trump worked on getting really pushing the vaccines to get it done. We wouldn't have a recovery. And I'm not promoting Trump party. I'm just saying that the vaccine recovery is the recovery in the U.S. and it is part of the inflation picture. But you had to have that vaccine push, and you couldn't have all those job growth. And the fact that we had increased unemployment, and that stickiness in the unemployment number has a lot more to do with the fiscal side and the fiscal response. Not saying that wouldn't have also happened under Trump. It's just a little bit more nuanced than who's in office. So with that, I think we have. Yeah, let me
throw in some interesting stats. So let's bring it back to our energy audience here. E&Ps are sexy again.
Yes.
Tech is burning down. E&Ps are up on the year. Not to mention oilfield services and midstream as well. My baby. We had Oasis just sold a package for $480 million. And what was interesting about that deal, which I really liked, was $75 million of the transaction was in contingent payments based on oil prices being at least $60 in 23, 24, and 25. So people are sharing this uncertainty. And I think that's a good structure to actually get deals done, is sharing the uncertainty about, valuation based on how the oil market's going to play out. A stat that I saw from the E&P team at Morgan Stanley, kudos to them, which is interesting, is that E&Ps collectively generated $6 billion in the first quarter of 2020, or 2021. 2021. Yeah, that's where we are. the highest quarterly level in over 10 years, going back to the pre-shale era, if you will. So, and 80% of the names were free cash flow positive.
Yep.
So we've got real free cash flow coming out of the energy sector. We've discarded this build NAV and destroy cash, or at least, spend more than you make.
But oil high prices, unexpectedly high prices in the first quarter of the year. And I mean, you heard that on every single earnings call.
Yeah, but a lot of people were hedged.
Yeah, they were. That's very true.
So that hurt, right? So on an unhedged basis, things look really good.
So an unhedged basis, things good. And you also had such massive cuts in spending from 2020, combined with that all the massive investor pressure, ESG pressure, climate change, everything. And then you roll that all over into 2021, where they say, well, hey, we're basically keeping things flat. And that's where you're at. So it is positive. Are you hearing as much as I'm hearing that I do hear globally way more concerns about the U.S. shale picking up? Is that there's so many concerns out of OPEC, and actually from if you read other journals and stuff from foreign journals, that shale is going to start getting back into gear, and they're watching the rig count and they're watching oil prices.
People always fight the last battle or the last war, and what they have gotten accustomed to is shale being, deservedly so, short cycle, right? So we can make things happen pretty quickly and pretty efficiently. And that's the last thing that really caused the great cave in of the oil market up to 2014, when we had the Halloween massacre with OPEC, where they said no mas. So they're looking at that. Massacre. That's what it was. It certainly hurt me. So, they should pay attention to that, but to me, that's a red herring, because it is the most transparent information market in the world. And the real question is what's going on elsewhere, because I think non-OPEC, non-US production is really the place where there's not as much information to really pay attention to. And
that's honestly where, this comes back to our kind of not bullish, but not as bullish of oil prices as everyone else, is just that I think this creates stability in the U.S. So all these changes and everything, and that's really the takeaway in our last podcast, which actually drops today, where we talk about earnings and everything, and listening to Occidental Petroleum's call. This stability of this health that you're explaining for the operators from decent oil prices, they are unhedged, so that makes me a little bit, or some of them are less hedged, makes me a little bit concerned going forward. But decent oil prices and the fact that they're free cash flow positive, and that you have had all these efficiency gains, massive efficiency gains. And I know that we're going to get some flack, and people are going to talk about, rip on us a little bit for these efficiency gains, but they're really real. And I think this also, Occidental talked significantly about the CO2 side. And will be, on the bandwagon with everyone else for ripping the purchase of Anadarko and the price that was paid for Anadarko and the debt that was taken from Warren Buffett and the price of that debt and 4% interest and all that, right? I'm on the same thing. But in terms of what is being done with the company now in the positioning, I do think the CO2, the fact that Vicky Hall talked about the recovery of going into conventionals with CO2, obviously it works. We know that. The fact that EOG talked about, going really targeting conventionals in the unconventional manner, that's really where the world's going, right? It's that in both, by the way, both Occidental and EOG are in Oman. EOG is only doing 2 wells this year, but these are companies that are going to take their knowledge from the U.S. shale and they're going to take it abroad, and it's going to unleash a lot. And the fact that, Vicky Halb is talking about, using CO2 reinjection in unconventional reservoirs to increase recovery. In fact, we have very, very low recovery rates in unconventional shale. And that's a good thing in the sense that there's still a lot of oil down there. But this is not over. Like the U.S. oil and gas space is not over. And we may not hit 11 or 13 million barrels per day again anytime soon, or maybe ever. But I think we can easily maintain 11 million barrels a day. And that is a risk. That's a bigger risk to OPEC than I think they realize when they want to bring their barrels back to market.
Yeah. And that is still a question mark around federal lands.
A huge question mark for federal lands.
And we don't have enough time to get into this, but I would recommend everyone watch Alex Epstein's congressional testimony, which was interesting because there are certainly the haters out there, as you can imagine. And as a reminder, he's the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. He's a philosopher. And the best they could do was ad hominem attacks for him wearing a T-shirt. Nobody's willing to directly engage with what he calls the clear thinking around energy poverty globally and the role of fossil fuels in meeting that demand. And I continue to think that the Chinese are taking us for a ride. They're out there building gigawatts and gigawatts of coal-fired power plants. Meanwhile, we're blocking pipelines, et cetera, and making energy costs higher in the U.S., which is just going to export industrial and energy-intensive manufacturing to places that aren't having those same energy policies. So
we're going to get into this in this IEA report.
So I definitely recommend at least reading his transcript, but watching the testimony is pretty great. So I do want to bring us back to the behemoth of the week before we run out of time, which is the IEA report.
Yes, but before we do that, real quick.
Of course.
I have to, because I have to, he was finally talking and I was like, I could pull up my charts here, so I have to do this. So Middle East Economic Survey has this awesome chart. And this is, they just stacked up basically. So this gets back to my sort of, not Permian bullish. Well, I am bullish on the Permian, but just the perspective of if you look at like 2017 versus now, and to Ethan's point on free cash flow positive and everything. So Middle East Economic Survey puts this chart together and they show you the production or the production targets, at least for these major oil producers in the Permian. And they show 2021 and you have Chevron and Pioneer at the top at 625,000 barrels per day, 618,000 barrels per day. And these are barrel oil equivalent per days. And then you have Oxy at 485, Exxon. So all these are stacked up. It's almost double what it was in 2017. And I think that's just important to point out because obviously we had a huge rig ramp in 2018, then it declined in 2019, and oil prices declined in 2018. The fact that we've continued these trajectories and these targets is really important because it shows the importance and relevance of the Permian Basin and all of the majors in the Permian Basin. But it also just shows that we haven't stopped growing. That these companies haven't necessarily stopped growing. And even if it's small and they're single digit percentages, it's still growth. And it's important to think about in the whole thing of, it's not like these guys are down and out.
Certainly not growing as much as the midstream companies would want to fill up that excess pipeline capacity, which is ample in most places except for maybe the Northeast.
Yes. And this is your perfect segue because according to the IEA report, and this is just amazing because everybody had super fun with this. So
let me set the tone here.
Okay.
So net zero by 2050. To do that, so they started with the conclusion. And what they said was no new oil and gas investments or fossil fuels, period. No coal, oil and gas, and no new ICE vehicles.
Beginning 2021, no new fossil fuel investment. So
and no new ICE vehicles after 2035, which is actually not crazy in terms of what they're mentioning. Although I don't know how you would take diesel.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll see. And then what's interesting is this report. So this is not their forecast. This is one of many scenarios they run. It was a thought experiment about how you get to 2050. But it was used as ammo by everybody who wants to say leave it in the ground. And it was widely criticized by everybody from banks to realists who realize you can't stop spending CapEx. And the interesting context is that after the pandemic hit, IEA described the lack of CapEx as staggering and warned about supply security.
Well, that's the really tricky thing is because this is really an antithesis to the JP Morgan report that came out a couple weeks ago that we referenced, and we will get into that. Both reports are you need to read them on your own.
That was Václav Smil and Mike Symbolist, who's the strategist at JP Morgan. Václav Smil at
least helped influence or guided it, but it's a really excellent report. Just basically explaining how hard it is. One, what has been the adoption rate of renewables to date, and the reasons why it's been hard, and lots of reasons why it's been difficult, and just pointing out how difficult it will be and cost and everything. Particularly, they do actually point out the chart on internal combustion engine, the cost of the vehicles versus their electric counterparts. And this is important for the IEA report because, Ford came out and said they're going to be releasing their electric F-150 next.
The Lightning
coming.
It looks awesome.
It looks like my F-150 in my garage. It's great. Except my F-150, I drove it home it gets over 600 miles, basically averages over 600 miles in the gas tank. And it's 200 miles door to door from here to my house outside of Craig, Colorado. And I get like 24 miles to the gallon. And I don't have range.
Is that diesel?
No, it's just gas. It's a V6 and gas engine, King Ranch, awesome truck. And the interesting thing is that, I've thought about this adoption of these F-150s a lot, and it's that you're going to adopt them in places where people don't need trucks. And admittedly, I don't need this truck, but I love it. I'm a truck girl. But on rabbit ears in the hot weather when I drive home in the summer, and in rabbit ears in the cold weather, I don't think the more expensive F-150 that is about 10, I think they were putting it over $70,000 or close to $80,000. It's not going to in those extreme temperatures. So I disagreed with Dan Pickering on Clubhouse when he was talking about his merge venture and saying he did think F-150s would get adopted from a fleet perspective because they would work. I don't think in Midland, when it's super hot in the summer, that they necessarily will work. I think there's times where they will work, but when you reduce that, when you have those range issues and stuff, it may or may not.
Time and place for everything. I mean, urban areas where there's construction, I think they would work great. And I also tweeted as an aside that the day that these things get sold, there is going to be some construction guy who throws a diesel genset in the back of it and uses it to charge the truck.
You did.
It will happen instantly.
Well, they just want the opportunity. But the whole point of this, so back to this IEA report. So I think it's the antithesis to the JP Morgan report in that it's very, IEA, we have to put this in context. So International Energy Agency, it does, when Ethan just mentioned that what they said earlier this year, one, it's counter to what their existing forecast outlook says. So their existing monthly IEA report, which you have to purchase for a couple grand, says that, we are going to hit, we're already nearing post-COVID recovery, but by August, we're essentially going to be over the 5-year average for demand for global oil products. And by the end of the year, we'll be hitting basically 100 million barrels a day of demand. So already their actual forecasts are off from what they want to happen in this report. And that begs the question, why is the International Energy Agency putting out things about what they want or should look like? Well, in the report, they say that they did this on the request of the UK president of the COP26. And if you just Google how IEA gets their funding, and I do think it's important to bring this up, and I'm positive I'm going to get some flack for this, but I think we need to start asking ourselves where the International Energy Agency is getting their funding. And I think it should be a little bit more transparent if they're putting out these reports, because the International Energy Agency was supposed to be this global watchdog when we
started in 1973 after the oil crisis, designed to create supply security.
Yes.
Focused on oil. Irony.
Exactly. As supply security, and we could even say that about energy, but this report is not anything. This report is saying you have to stop. I mean, the fact that you're telling people stop investing in fossil, you're basically telling people through this report to stop investing in fossil fuels now. And then the greatest thing is this price outlook. Holy crap. The price outlook is amazing because in 2021, they're saying $35 oil. One, it's not $35 oil in 2021, but that's what they're putting in this. And so their presumption for all this to work is very, very low oil prices, which doesn't actually work because everybody and their dog is going to be using oil prices like mad. So this whole outlook, it's net zero, right? And it's by the way, the target for net zero is that it's a thought exercise partly too. So I'll give them credit for that. It's a thought exercise. It's basically saying we can do this. This is how we achieve net zero by 2050. And here's how we go about doing it. And they're basically saying we do have the tools in our toolbox, even if half the technologies aren't ready to deploy immediately, they will be ready to deploy by 2035, and that we need to be investing everything now. The numbers for solar and wind that they put in, and that's what is a little disturbing for me, because they're banking to get to these numbers, which is a 50% probability. So to hit their degree Celsius targets that they want to hit to prevent the catastrophe that's assumed with hitting a 2-degree number, to hit their global targets, they have a 50% probability. So half, F. So they could be wrong. So you could work all this way, trillions and trillions of dollars spent to do all of this, and your probability is only 50% that you're actually going to achieve it. That to me is very, very scary. And it's not that I'm criticizing that stuff doesn't need to be done. It's that you have to be more predictable. And the reason oil and gas guys get so frustrated with this is because they're numbers people. We don't work in a 50% probability world. We can't drill a well with 50% probability that it's going to pan out.
Not that doesn't stop people.
It hasn't stopped people. And you do have dry holes and you have poor wells. But the point is that I think there's questions about, we know that methane is bad for the environment, but we don't measure it the same way. We don't have a perfect methane emissions chart that we do for global CO2 emissions. So investors now tend to focus on CO2 emissions as opposed to methane, even though methane is supposedly 30 times, worse for the environment, more concentrated, but it stays in the atmosphere less long, so that you can have a greater immediate impact on it now. So all these technologies, everything's proposed, essentially ramp up wind, ramp up solar, and don't invest in any fossil fuels at all anymore, and then you basically decline off this. So the problem with that is that the International Energy Forum, so the IEF, the IEA, and OPEC, we talked about this, they did their forum in February. This wasn't the answer that came out of that forum. The International Energy Forum and the IEA did not come out and say, stop investing in fossil fuels today. They said, in fact, we're going to have a big price spike if we don't invest in fossil fuels. And even Spencer Dale, which we talked about in the podcast, even Spencer Dale BP said, I think the investment community does not understand exactly climate, understanding ESG pressures and everything. And the fact that just because we're declining demand doesn't mean we still don't need crude oil. So the problem with reports like this is they will be taken. I think one of the few that agreed with it was IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency, which essentially said that we already said this before. We can do this. It's super easy peasy, blah, blah, blah. It's not, they didn't say it's easy peasy. They did say it's hard, but that we can do this. But they've gotten, banks, everyone basically just said this is kind of ridiculous. The fact that we're even talking about it, we're probably giving it too much credibility because
in the understatement of all time, OPEC said that it will lead to volatility.
Oh, yes. Lead to volatility. OPEC would love this because they show their market share going up. But even then, demand is reduced to 24 million barrels per day. So, and they use 2019 levels. So they say 90 million barrels a day in 2019. We are not at 90 million barrels a day demand. Okay. We are at probably 97, 98 million barrels a day demand if we're absorbing these barrels. So let's just say we're at 97. So you're going from 97 million barrels to 24 million barrels a day in a pretty short time period. This isn't even, in those previous forecasts we looked at, which they said we need to be, that's basically like in their aggressive one, they say we need to do that by, down to 67 million barrels a day by 2030. The demand crunch on this it's so big. And yes, so this report is free. You can check it out on their website. They also have they came out with their electric vehicle report and everything. And they say that we've had massive electric vehicle sales, in 2020. That's great. Try to go buy a used car now. You can't get a used car. You can't get a new car, but you can't get a used car because everybody wants them. And traffic is at all-time highs because nobody's taking public transportation anymore. The economies are reopening. Public transportation, I think that there's kind of some risks in some of these infrastructure bills for Biden because the COVID has changed people's affection toward public transport. That can go away. I'm not saying that won't go away. We won't get back to normal, but it doesn't right now. People want to drive their own vehicles.
Yeah, and you can't buy a bicycle either, which is interesting.
Yeah, you can't buy a bicycle. So, I walk everywhere in Denver, but the point is so their price outlook is really interesting and that it's extremely low. And the fact that they even put it in there, they also put in their adoption of solar and wind. And so it's huge. They said it's equivalent to building out. Basically, they tell everyone you have to put all your money now. You have to be investing really, really hardcore right now and doing things immediately to make these changes. And that you have to be adopting, huge. It's like 660 gigawatts of wind. Massive adoption. It's basically, they said it's the equivalent to 20 times what we're doing right now. So you're building all stuff out. Not once do they mention in this report about the solar panels being made from Xinjiang. And I say this because this is really...
We will need a lot of slave labor to build this much solar.
This is really growing. The fact that you have reports like this saying that you have to do this now. When are we going to hear the environmental community come out and say, we probably need to pivot to wind in the near term if we want to hit these targets? Because 80% of the world's solar panels are coming from China. At least 50% of them are coming from Xinjiang. And that we know this is slave labor. These are internment camps. And this is not okay. The UN just, again, China, listen to that podcast, China Geopolitics. The UN just had a meeting and we do have some people who are still on the human rights bandwagon who really care about this. And they're basically saying, nobody has been in UN human rights folks have not been into China since 2005. So
there was, in fairness, there was one company, and I don't recall the name right now, one solar manufacturer that just allowed in observers to demonstrate that they didn't have
and that's clearly BS. It's like when North Korea
or maybe not, but at least they were there was a charm offensive to address this, but it by no means is industry wide. So
I think that charm offensive was actually, so China said, hey, don't do this. They did it anyway. And really China was saying, do it, play it up. Of course,
you don't do anything without that.
Right. So they're doing it. That's a whole game. They're showing you what you want to see. And they can't, when you talk to people, they basically say, well, we could do some, we could basically make sure that we're not getting those solar panels. So you can't, at the adoption rates that they're telling you to adopt for solar and wind, because that's the technologies we have in place now. So it's massive adoption. It's, ramping up everything we possibly can in the near term with existing technologies of solar and wind. So it means that you'd be buying all these from China now. And the fact that 50% of the world's solar panels are coming from Xinjiang, you're just enabling this.
And what's interesting is there's a guy named Mike Schellenberger, who is a nuclear advocate from the environmental perspective. And he pointed out that a significant part of the declining cost of manufacturing solar panels actually came from the labor arbitrage in China, which if you all of a sudden said, hey, we're going to boycott Chinese solar because the supply chain is just too toxic, you could actually see some of that efficiency gain come back. You had to make solar panels in Albany or Arizona where they actually make a ton of sense. The cost of manufacturing is going to be a lot higher.
Well, and we have a U.S. solar company, and I believe obviously they're advocating for this because it's made here. But it is, we talked about in previous podcasts, it is extremely energy intensive, and that's why they use some of the biggest coal power plants in China. And we're going to get to this in a second because this report assumes that they won't be using any coal in China. So they're using all these these coal power plants to make these solar panels with forced labor. And they did flood the market. So when people say that solar panels and wind have gone down in price, they made it there. They do have cheap labor. There's a reason why we outsource to China, and that's what businesses do. But at the point where it's forced labor and you're not paying for anything, of course it's cheap. This will have to change. I do think these voices are growing. I don't think that the folks, and the pushback China has on this, they just deny it. They just say, of course, no, we don't have any human rights abuses. We don't know what you're talking about. I mean, it's the entire province of Xinjiang. I mean, this is re-education camps. So that's okay. For Muslim League,
it's very Pol Pot.
I mean, it's so, it's really, really disturbing. It's disturbing that it doesn't get as much attention in this day and age. And then that China Geopolitics podcast is super interesting because the gentleman there who puts the China perspective, he does say the defenses. He says, well, they did this in Germany. Hitler had these camps. They liken this to, other countries did it and now they're fine. It wasn't okay then. It's not okay now. And it
can't have it both ways.
And it's 2021. So if the U.S. was doing this, I'd sure as hell hope would be called out for it. And I don't want this happening. So not saying lots of countries have stuff under, this taking place. And we have
the Japanese internment camps in World War II, which everyone would agree are horrific now. Yeah. But at the time, they were rationalized and justified. But we just can't allow that in our supply chain.
And I think that it's interesting because it's like, well, if the climate crisis is so bad now, it's like, well, it's so bad now, so we got to do it now, and then we'll sort of deal with that problem later. Like, what's the point of having a world if the humanitarian issues are really real, and this whole thing with China, which Biden talks about, of like letting them eat our lunch, this is letting them eat our lunch. So you find an alternative, make it in other countries, go, and this is why Taiwan is rising up. This issues are bubbling up because they make the bulk of the semiconductors and they're a major issue. And so if China wanted to go after them this year, they would cause lots of problems. And so these issues are not going away, whether it's solar panels in Zhejiang or anything else made in t-shirts. I mean, you name it, whatever's made there, it's a real issue and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
No, I mean, it's nuts. I mean, the list of examples of insane energy policy outcomes is long. So you can't build gas pipelines in the Northeast. So what do you end up with? Russian LNG tankers parked in Boston during the winter to have spikes. You want clean and renewable power. So you import Chinese solar panels with questionable supply chain, but you won't allow a high voltage transmission line in from Canada into the Northeast to allow for an expansion of really good baseload hydropower into the Northeast because of NIMBY concerns. I mean, the list of these problems, like, let's say, for example, lithium mining in Nevada, there are people pushing back on that. So it's insane, these sort of NIMBY issues here that prevent us from having stable, secure energy. And we're allowing for these things abroad that people are just sort of, just letting happen.
Yeah. And I think it's just
virtue signal.
It's sort of virtue signal, but it's the reality. And I think that's just what I want to ground this in reality, is that these reports, the reaction I was getting from peers and folks on Twitter was just that it was bananas. And I just don't know how, as a thought exercise, it's interesting. It does bother me that this was done at the request of the president of the COP26 in the UK, which sounds to me like the UK is probably trying to validate their own policies that they're doing. It also makes me question what Fatih Birol, given that he hasn't, the way he used to talk about U.S. shale. Fatih Birol is the head of the International Energy Agency, but the way he used to talk about U.S. shale, the way he was very bullish on U.S. shale and understanding it. And, this big pivot now I listened to an interview of him last night because I was just curious as to where this was coming from. This big pivot now on doing all this, it doesn't make sense, right? It's not grounded in reality, and they've become an advocacy organization. And that means that their data stuff, the stuff that people spend thousands of dollars a year on their monthly data stuff, I would say you may start having to question, because you're either you typically you can't be both, right? And so then you have to start questioning their funding, where they're getting their funding and who's pushing this stuff, and what's the point of really doing it? But we're not poo-pooing renewables and saying you can't have renewables and you can't do this, but it's beyond complex, and it's going to be extremely messy. Some things are going to work, some things are not going to work. But I guarantee you, this scenario, you 80 which ways to Sunday, this will not work. You will bankrupt economies, and at a 50% probability, you may not solve the problem you're trying to actually solve. Right. And you're going to exacerbate it. If you're relying on China for this much of what you need, and it assumes that China's complying with all their power things, I don't think China can produce all those solar panels without the coal power. It's not possible.
Right. So coal-fired power creating solar panels.
Right. So it just doesn't make sense, at least in the near term. No matter how you spin this, you're going to increase emissions in the near term. We've said this before, but also if those prices, so their price trajectory, and we'll put a link to this on the podcast, but their price trajectory for oil prices is so low. I mean, we're talking $30 oil prices in the 30s and low prices. And assuming that you have no demand at $30 oil prices, or 35 or 40, everyone and their dog is going to burn this crude oil. So it just doesn't, these things don't really make sense. But I mean, that's what they sort of need to put in line with saying you don't really need to invest in it because demand, we stop demand right. And everything. But it just, it doesn't work. And we probably didn't do this justice because we're going off on a lot of tangents, but we will definitely circle.
That. Tangents and digressions are part and parcel for this.
But we are passionate about this. We will certainly circle back to this topic.
So I just want to put a nail in the coffin. I've coined a phrase, scope 4 emissions. And scope 4 emissions include things like Leonardo DiCaprio's private jet and fancy models full of yachts emissions while making movies about containing global warming. It's hot air reports like this that are completely unrealistic, that do not add, but actually distort the debate.
They say that if we cycle more, and I sound really critical because I am, but they say if we walk more and we cycle more, we change consumer behavior.
Setting the thermostat to different levels.
Yes. I mean, I walked around, so I'm walking because I do a lot of walking right now, but I'm walking around and I'm noticing, look at all the cars parked on the streets. The fact that they don't have garages to plug in their would-be electric vehicles. But the fact that the housing boom is so crazy that a garage was just torn down, which I assume they're going to they bought the house, an investor probably bought the house, took out the garage and is going to build a house right there. So split the lot in half, and it's going to be super tiny. Meaning there is no garage, right? So you're going to have electric cords come out of these houses, plugging in these.
There are 50 million multiple dwelling units in the United States that would need to be retrofitted somehow. Yeah, this is a sticky
their
challenge.
$1 trillion numbers seem off too, but we will get into this again.
Yeah. Well, May 21st, episode 17 yes. I think was I'm pretty proud of this one.
Yeah,
I like
I am too.
This may be the only podcast where you actually want to slow it down to listen to it rather than accelerate it, because as you can tell, Trisha starts talking faster and louder the more passionate she gets. She is your PetroNerd. So if you need help with something, she's a good consultant and will advocate for you and will help you get to the brass tacks on decision making. The CEO of PetroNerds, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Ethan, and happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, guys.
Signing off until next time.